Welcome to our exploration of Camp Montreat for girls. As with much of Montreat, this story has deep roots. People have built cottages, attended conferences, and come to Montreat for varying lengths of time since its inception in 1897. Mountain Retreat Association President Robert C. Anderson early on realized that the children who came with their parents needed some structured activity. So in 1912, he hired 3 young teachers to provide summer programming. And this was the beginning of Montreat summer clubs. 5 years later, he had the first youth conference to be held in Montreat. Building on this success, in 1924, Dr. Anderson decided to open a residential camp for girls that would last for 8 weeks and provide yet more opportunities for young people to enjoy Montreat for a long period of time. The purpose, as was declared in an early brochure, and I quote, was to show that young people can be entertained without the questionable forms found in so many places. Dr. Anderson had the perfect location for the camp, too. Several years earlier, he and W. H. Belk of Charlotte had purchased 28 acres in Montreat from the estate of John Else Hyler, who was a New York philanthropist and a very early supporter of Montreat. Hyler had built a lodge on this property, and Belk and Anderson renamed it Andelk Lodge. You get it? Anderson, Belk, Andelk Lodge. This would be the central part of the camp. Publicity for this camp, and I will quote, noted that it offered an opportunity for girls to spend 8 weeks in the delightful climate of the mountains of western North Carolina under the care of experienced workers with young people. Parents realize that the summers under our present social conditions are becoming more and more a menace to young people. Camp Montreat, with its ideals, beautiful surroundings, and wonderful opportunities, offers its services to parents in helping them to solve their vacation problems and to give the girls the happiest summer possible. But who would run this camp? Well, Dr. Anderson had a solution for that too. The same year that the camp was to open, in 1924, he hired an educator by the name of S.L. Woodward to become principal of the Montreat Normal School. Whether or not Woodward knew it, Dr. Anderson also expected him to run the Montreat Summer Club and the brand new Montreat Camp for Girls. Now, for someone who had served as superintendent of public schools in Plant City, Florida, and in Morristown, Tennessee, this must have seemed like a rather strange assignment. Nonetheless, he remained in Montreat for 9 years, strengthening the normal school so that it became Montreat Junior College when he left in 1933, and he also provided a strong foundation for Camp Montreat for girls. But what did this camp look like? Well, it operated for 8 weeks each summer, and girls were encouraged to come for the full 8 weeks. You could come for less amount of time, but they first enrolled all of the full summer campers. Although it was designed to be primarily recreational, campers in the early years had the opportunity to take classes with the Montreat Normal School. Those classes included English, history, Latin, French, and mathematics. And I can see Woodward, the educator's hand in this. Other personnel led activities like arts and crafts, dramatic productions, music, and athletics. Daily activities included hiking, horseback riding, arts and crafts, and of course swimming in the lake. Every camper was expected to be able to swim by the time she left. They took occasional outings to Chimney Rock, Catawba Falls, Mount Mitchell. During its first years, Camp Montreat had a relatively few number of campers, usually fewer than 30. Quite a few of these early campers, about a third of them, came from Morristown, Tennessee, which is where Woodward had lived before coming to Montreat, and suggests that he was probably a pretty good recruiter. Now, to ensure a lively spirit, contests were a major part of the summer experience. Campers belonged to one of two tribes, either the Mohawk or the Navajo, that, as the brochure suggested, kept something going all the time by the keen rivalry and contests and pranks which they are constantly playing on each other. Dramatic presentations and pageants were yet another part of the activities. But before any of these activities began, right after breakfast and room inspection, came Bible hour, which really only lasted about 20 minutes. Classes followed, and then after lunch and rest period, the fun could begin. And of course, Sundays were structured quite differently. The campers always came to Sunday school and church, and in the afternoon they were encouraged to read, write letters, or perhaps take walks, and a vesper service closed the day. The physical heart of Camp Montreat was Andelk Lodge. Along with the smaller annex, these buildings provided sleeping quarters, dining and kitchen facilities, and an assembly room. The facility was located just behind Anderson Auditorium, so it had easy walking access to Montreat grounds, which of course included Lake Susan. And the counselors were chosen with great care. I quote again from an early brochure. They must be young women of consecrated Christian character, of exceptional intelligence, refinement, and personality, together with the ability to supervise some camp activity. They must be fully in sympathy with young life, possess a love for working with girls, and a willingness to give themselves fully to the campers. They were expected to be a companion to these girls, to see that they enter wholeheartedly into all camp activities and use every opportunity for instilling in them the highest ideals. In other words, the camp counselors did not seem to have much of a personal life outside the camp. This 8-week experience at Camp Montreat cost $200, plus a little more if you wanted to participate in horseback riding. But there was more expenses than just these $200. Campers had to bring appropriate uniforms. Now, many of us are accustomed to seeing Camp Montreaters in their navy shorts, white blouses, and navy kerchiefs. But in the 1920s, appropriate uniforms included khaki, middies, and bloomers. Skirts or simple dresses. They also had to bring bed linens, towels, a variety of suitable shoes, heavy sweaters, rain gear, and a bathing suit. And that still wasn't all. They were also advised to bring a tennis racket, books, games, a flashlight, and of course a camera. Now, all of this should be packed in a steamer trunk, shipped by rail to the Black Mountain Depot to be there when the girls arrived for camp. So you can see there was more expense to coming to camp for the summer than just the $200 paid to Camp Montreat. Woodward's departure in 1933 created a bit of a leadership hole, not only for the new college, but also for Camp Montreat. Why did he leave? Well, Dr. Anderson could be a bit challenging to work with, but there is no evidence to suggest that his departure was anything other than an educator on the move which is exactly how he had come to Montreat in the first place and built his career. The college yearbook that year was dedicated to him, and in 1949, Woodward and his wife returned to Montreat for the 25th anniversary of Camp Montreat. Dr. Anderson soon found a new person to be director of Camp Montreat. Her name was Alice McBride. She had worked at Camp Montreat while Woodward was there, so she knew the ins and outs of Camp Montreat. She understood Montreat itself, and she understood Dr. Anderson. She remained in this position until 1949. It was during this 15-year time period that Mackie, as she was known, built the Camp Montreat that many people of the later years remember so well. Unfortunately, the annual reports of the Mountain Retreat Association are frustratingly brief when it comes to describing what life was like at Camp Montreat in the 30s and 40s. We do, however, have some correspondence between Anderson and McBride, as well as a few promotional brochures. We know, for instance, that by 1938, a new residential building had been added to the campus, some bridle trails had been completed, and an archery field set up. But the earlier buildings were experiencing considerable deferred maintenance. So in 1938, McBride requested $2,000 from Anderson for repairs, upgrades, and expansions. Dr. Anderson replied to her that perhaps she could cut costs elsewhere and pay for these issues herself. To which she replied that she was in no position to cut expenses. And then she reminded him that Camp Montreat had to compete with other camps in the area, and it had come down to fix up or close up, and furthermore, while he was at it, she needed a new recreation hall. She didn't get her recreation hall right away, but Anderson did agree that she could use 2 new tennis courts that was being built on Montreat grounds. 2 new lodges were built. After all, if you have more lodges, you can have more campers. They also had a small arts and crafts facility that was constructed. But one of the most important new features was the council ring. Mackie had continued the tradition of competition, and she expanded these opportunities for the campers between the Mohawks and the Navajos. Now, according to camp legend, those 2 tribes had once lived peacefully together in western North Carolina, although in reality, neither the Mohawks nor the Navajos ever lived anywhere near the region. Nevertheless, this division sparked great competition throughout the summer, and at the end of the summer, they had a ceremonial burying of the hatchet. The council ring was the one place where all campers could assemble peacefully. No pranks in the council ring. That was where they had evening programs, campfires, and hot dog and marshmallow roasts. The year of World War II were pretty challenging. The camp did remain open, but as you can imagine, there were issues. Mackie reported that termites were busily destroying Andelk Lodge, and she also had a failing refrigerator, and she noted that without adequate cooling capacity, she would not be able to open the camp. Now, she knew this camp was important to Anderson, and so she played what she saw as her strongest card to get what she needed. Anderson responded to her that he would try to find a refrigerator at a reasonable price, but if not, she should just go ahead and open. And he said to her, "I think that we will not have any trouble with Mr. Nelson, the health inspector." Apparently, Dr. Anderson knew people. He and Mackie also discussed financial practices for the camp, which evidently were somewhat informal. In 1944, Anderson told her that the auditor had found a $400 discrepancy, so she sent him a complete handwritten account of all of her expenditures. And she did have an incentive to show a profit, because in addition to the modest salary that she received, she split the year-end profit with the college endowment fund. A 1942 camp brochure provides a good glimpse of life at camp then, as well as the strong recruiting methods. It offers a number of appealing pictures, including one from the gym that had recently been built. It also contained a letter from a well-known child care specialist at the time, Dr. Frank Robinson, who lived part-time in Black Mountain. He touted the virtues of both the camp and Alice McBride. And the daily schedule had changed just a little bit as well. The summer school classes were gone. Bible hour was still just half an hour. And the cost, interestingly, for 8 weeks was $190, which was actually $10 less than in the 1920s. Dr. Anderson retired in 1947, and Mackey had to contend with new leadership with the Mountain Retreat Association in the person of Dr. Rupert McGregor, who was the former financial officer for MRA. These two did not see eye to eye. In a letter to Anderson after he had retired, McBride mentions that her feelings had been hurt in the office on several occasions. She didn't go into specifics. It's quite possible that finances and financial accounting practices were part of the issue. It's possible that the type of programming was a part of the issue. At any rate, at the end of 1949, McBride left Camp Montreat. She became part owner of what at the time was known as Bridewood Acres, a failing camp in Black Mountain. Dr. Anderson helped her make this purchase, and he also helped her to refurbish the camp with personal loans. Not surprisingly, many campers followed this popular leader rather than return to Camp Montreat. We know this camp today as Camp Merrimack. Fortunately for Camp Montreat, Sarah Anderson, who had worked with McBride, accepted the directorship, and during her 3-year tenure, she was able to successfully recruit a good number of campers and to secure the continuity of the facility. She retained many of the most significant activities, like the Mohawk Navajo competition, a lot of physical activities, and she also expanded it just a bit to include more in the way of personal growth and learning. So now, not only did Montreat campers, for instance, learn to swim, but life-saving was offered as an opportunity at the camp. Now, by 1953, Dr. McGregor was able to report that while many camp facilities were in need of a repair, which is no longer a surprise, he was quite pleased with the attendance, and many campers were returning for multiple years. The next step forward for Camp Montreat came in 1960, when Jane Clardy Sands became the director. She was from Ocala, Florida, and she had a long history with Camp Montreat. She had come as a camper. She had been a counselor. She had served as the writing instructor before becoming the director. And we can also see Camp Montreat becoming a bit more complicated in terms of administration. Her husband, Russell Sands, served as the camp administrator at the time. What she brought to this role was significantly enhancing the horsemanship. She brought her own horses from Florida each year, for which she charged Camp Montreat, of course. And she encouraged the young women to participate in riding, to take instruction, to enter local horse competitions. And in fact, many of the young girls at Camp Montreat were very successful in local competitions. After 3 years, though, she came to the conclusion that she simply could not raise her 2 young children and serve as the director of Camp Montreat in the summer. Succeeding her was Mrs. Fred Turner. Mrs. Turner had been the dietitian at Camp Montreat for the previous 2 years, and she was also from Ocala. In her first season, just as often happens when you have a change of director, she had many new counselors and a lot of new campers. But she had proved to be an outstanding recruiter. In her first year, more campers attended Camp Montreat than in any of the previous 5 years. Now, by this time, campers either came for the first session, which was a month, the second session, which was also a month, or they could come and attend both sessions. In her first year, there were 63 enrolled for the first session and 80 in the second session. And of course, that 80 included some who were there all summer. 3 years later, those numbers had increased considerably. First session had gone from 63 to 85. Second session had gone from 80 to 110. But trouble was on the horizon. The final season for Camp Montreat was 1967. The real question is why? Speculation then and now had it that Camp Montreat refused to accept black campers and closed rather than be forced to do so. But there is no evidence to support that conclusion. Records from the time period of the late 1950s and the early 1960s show a number of discussions related to segregation, particularly in terms of housing for workers and conference attendees, but none of these conversations referred to the camp. The problems with continuing the camp appear from the extant records to have been of a very different nature. In 1963, the year that Jane Sands departed, MRA President C. Greer Davis had actually asked the staff members who were responsible for the club program whether or not the camp facilities might be used to enhance clubs. While a copy of this report has not surfaced, it would seem that Davis was beginning to think that perhaps Camp Montreat had served its purpose in terms of the MRA mission. Then there were financial problems. Prior to the 1966 season, camp facilities required extensive repair, including $1,000 just to bring the plumbing up to code. While no other specific expenses were mentioned, Davis reported that additional funds would be used, if required, out of the 1966 budget. But such was not to be. Davis had formed a committee of 5 people to prepare a report examining the role and the purpose of Camp Montreat. This report does exist in the Heritage Center archives. The committee concluded that while the camp had always provided a fine program and very capable leadership, a combination of factors was leading the committee to recommend that the camp be closed. First was the cost. By this time, $250 was the cost of a 4-week session at Camp Montreat. Now, the committee noted that this was not out of line with what other camps charged, but that it was perhaps a bit more expensive than their pool of potential campers would be able to afford. I should note here, however, that if you'll remember, the camp registration not only was not lagging, it was in fact growing. Second, Montreat College, which actually owned the land and the facilities, seemed like it was not getting a good return on its investment. Repairs were continuous and costly. It took about 65 paying campers just to break even. The buildings were all in various states of disrepair. They included the now 25-year-old gym, 2 houses that were simply called of considerable age, and 4 buildings that had actually been constructed for camp use out of ex-Army facilities and lots of plywood. They required constant attention, and they were not appealing. Third, and this may be the crux of the matter, the landscape architect hired by the college recommended that the site of the camp would be the best place to situate a new athletic field and amphitheater for the college. This recommendation was made as the college was beginning a new capital fund campaign to build a science building, a library, and a women's residence hall. In other words, the camp, while providing high-quality programming, required too much in the way of financial support, and it occupied a prime location that the college felt it could use to better advantage in other ways. So this special committee recommended that Camp Montreat be discontinued and the property be transferred from the college endowment to the college Buildings and Grounds Committee for such use by the college and the MRA as might be mutually agreeable. Quite a few campers were disheartened when they received a letter in the autumn of 1967 indicating that Camp Montreat would close. However, many of them, wanting to return to the area, found a welcoming home with Camp Merrimack. Because that camp had been resurrected in 1949 by Mackey McBride, it looked and operated quite a bit like Camp Montreat. And so Camp Merrimack reached out personally to all of the Camp Montreat 1967 young ladies, inviting them to consider coming to Camp Merrimack, and many of them did. So this summer, as you drive by Camp Merrimack on Montreat Road and you see the young ladies at the end of the driveway waving at you, wave back to them. There's a Montreat heritage here.